Today we're going to cover perception, culture, and how it affects communication at work. So first, perception. Perception is the process through which we interpret our experiences and come to our unique understandings. Perceptions affect how we communicate with others and how we interpret others' communication. Understanding perception's role in the communication process is crucial to our success as communicators. But you may be asking, perceptions of what? Well, perceptions can be thought of as our interpretation of things, interpretation of what we see, hear, or touch. And our perceptions or interpretations are unique to us. But we can't interpret something until we have decided to select something to interpret. How we select information involves sifting through what we consider important in every situation. Now, we do this all the time, but we're helped by something called schemas. Schemas are mental structures that help us put together bits of information to form patterns and create meaning. Schemas functions are to help us to understand and anticipate how things work or should work. They may change the more we interact with people, places, things. For example, when you were a small child, you may have first developed a schema for a cat. You know it's small, furry, has 4 legs, whiskers, and a tail. So from now on, when you encounter a cat, you don't have to think about it too much. Now imagine your new roommate comes home with a Sphynx cat. Your existing schema of a cat no longer works. Why? Have you ever seen a Sphynx cat? My cousin got one recently. Here's what it looks like. Well, this has 4 legs, a tail, whiskers, but is not furry. Not furry at all. It's a hairless cat. Now you have to adjust or change your schema of a cat. This is a process called assimilation or accommodation. They differ slightly. In assimilation, new information is incorporated into pre-existing schema. So in our cat example, you know that not all cats are furry. In accommodation, existing schemas might be altered or new schemas formed as you learn new information or have new experiences. So back to the cat example. A friend of mine had this experience. She no longer thinks all cats are adorable. She has accommodated her perception of cats because the Sphynx cat completely freaks her out. And while schemas are useful because they let us take shortcuts in interpreting the vast amounts of information that's available to us, and we use schemas in most situations, again, automatically and with little or no effort. But there are challenges with using schemas. These mental frameworks also cause us to exclude important information and instead focus on things that confirm our pre-existing beliefs and ideas. For this reason, schemas contribute to stereotypes and cause us to rely on stereotypes or misinformation. Schemas may lead to uncritical, passive information processing, or mindlessness as opposed to mindfulness or focused assessment. Signs of mindlessness include reduced cognitive activity, inaccurate recall, and uncritical evaluation. Schemas may cause selective perception. This is where you select information based on existing schemas, usually in a biased manner. Schemas can cause distorted perceptions that lead us to judge events based on information that is most vivid to us, so what stands out to us. And schemas may cause undue influence or give a piece of information greater credibility than it truly warrants. This can lead to prejudice, which we will cover more in a moment. But essentially, by holding certain beliefs about a particular group of people, existing schema may cause people to interpret situations incorrectly. So let's consider gender expectations and stereotypes. Everyone has a schema for what they consider feminine and masculine in their culture. These schemas lead to stereotypes about how we expect men and women to behave and the roles we expect them to fill. When my nephews and nieces were younger, we used to take them to the movies quite a bit. We went to see a movie that had a particularly moving scene. My husband teared up. I did not. My nephew was concerned. Weren't the girls supposed to cry at movies, not boys? An example of how a schema leads to stereotyping, right? Well, we explained that this wasn't the case, that everyone has feelings and everyone expresses feelings for different things in different ways, etc. Hopefully this experience and our guidance helped him adjust his existing schema of how women and men express emotion. Interpreting your perceptions. So attributions are when you use personal characteristics to try to explain behavior. These may include internal attributions, or attributing behavior to someone's personality, and external attributions, when you attribute behavior to something outside of a person's control. Fundamental attribution error says that we overemphasize the internal and underestimate the external causes of behavior we see in others. But the opposite is true when it comes to ourselves. This is called self-serving bias. In other words, when we see someone doing something, we tend to think it related to their personality rather than the situation the person might be in. But when we do something, we always have a good reason. For example, imagine a friend who doesn't return your call. You could think, what a jerk. I should drop them as a friend. But consider fundamental attribution error. Maybe there are other reasons they haven't called back. Maybe they're going through something major in life, traveling for work, or they just forgot. Self-serving bias is our tendency to attribute positive events to our own character, but attribute negative events to external factors. It's a common type of cognitive bias, and unfortunately, I see it in practice all the time. For example, a student gets an A for an assignment, and the student thinks, of course, I'm so awesome. This is internal attribution. Now, the same student gets a D plus on a midterm, and the student thinks, well, duh, the professor made this exam much harder than it needed to be. External attribution. Instead of taking into consideration the fact that not only did the student not study much, they skimmed the reading and didn't view most of the lecture material. Sometimes when people are depressed, the attribution style is flipped. They attribute positive events to chance or help from someone, and they attribute negative events to their own character. So why so much emphasis on our perceptions? Well, our perceptions are linked to the wide diversity we encounter in the world. What do we mean by diversity? Diversity is the differences among people, such as race, education, ability, geography, and so on. Effective communication requires us to understand and appreciate those who are different from ourselves. And perceptual barriers are challenges we may encounter that can give rise to barriers in competent communication. These include having a narrow perspective. In other words, people often see things through their own circumstances. Cultural myopia is when people fail to consider the other cultural perspectives and assume their own culture is appropriate and relevant in all situations. Stereotyping, we touched on that a moment ago when we covered schemas, but it's defined as an impression of a group of people that is fixed so that you apply a set of perceptions to an entire group. We also touched on prejudice earlier, but this is described as a deep-seated feeling of unkindness and ill will toward particular groups or an individual, usually based on negative stereotypes. Well, we reviewed perceptions and why they are important. Now let's discuss how one can improve perceptions. Here are 3 suggestions. Be thoughtful, specifically when you seek explanations. Don't just go with the most obvious explanation for what you observe. Look beyond first impressions by delaying reactions or judgments until making further perceptions. And question your assumptions by not assuming you know what others think, feel, or believe based on their group affiliations or a host of other cultural factors. So moving to culture, this is a learned system of thought and behavior that typifies a large group of people and includes their beliefs, values, and practices. Culture applies to any broadly shared group identity, not simply a person's nationality. Culture is learned from parents, peer groups, teachers, and media. Observations shape your worldview or how you interpret the world and the people in it. Culture includes nonverbal and conscious behavior and verbal language. We use communication to express our culture, including the topics we choose to share and in what settings. Culture also affects how we perceive other people's communication. Intercultural communication is communication between people from different cultures who have different worldviews that may lead to different interpretations and expectations. Intercultural communication is important for a number of reasons, including the fact that we live in a very diverse society. So to understand others, we must be able to communicate interculturally. Also, as our society has become more mobile, we access different cultures both face-to-face and through electronic media. Furthermore, the internet and other technologies give us increased access to people across the country and around the world. And as the organizations we belong to become more diverse, we need to be aware of how culture impacts our communication, particularly in business. The U.S. is a pluralistic, multicultural society, and the U.S. workplace is just as diverse and complex as our society. We can assess cultural similarities and differences in many ways, but for our purposes, we'll look at high versus low context, collectivist versus individualistic societies, and power distance. Let's begin with context. Context is defined as the information that surrounds an event. Here, it refers to how people in a culture deliver, receive, and interpret messages. High context cultures derive meaning not just from the words spoken, but from the context surrounding those words. Meaning is conveyed subtly in order to save face or maintain social harmony. High context cultures use contextual cues such as time, place, relationship, and situation to interpret meaning and send those subtle messages. Examples of high context cultures include Japan, Korea, China, Latin America, and African countries. Low context cultures, on the other hand, rely on explicit terms to communicate. Meaning is conveyed by the words spoken. Low context cultures use direct language and rely less on situational factors to derive meanings. Examples of low context cultures include the United States, Canada, Australia, and most of Northern Europe, European countries. Individualistic cultures tend to rely on low context communication. In individualistic cultures, people tend to value an individual's achievements, satisfaction, and independent thinking. The focus is on problems, on autonomy with a preference for competition. Individualist cultures place value on autonomy, personal space, and privacy, with very little attention to hierarchy or status. By contrast, in collectivist cultures, who rely more on high-context communication, people put the good of the group or organization before their own individual interests. Obligation and loyalty to the group are more important than one's own achievement. Collectivist cultures communicate from a group perspective, emphasizing cooperation, group harmony, group decision-making, and long-term stable friendships with a clear hierarchy. Examples include many Arab and Latin American cultures, as well as many Asian cultures. Power distance considers the way that power and status is divided among individuals, or how cultures perceive inequality and authority. High power distance cultures have a strong hierarchy based on class, birth order, job title, and so on among groups. This may lead to more anxiety when speaking with those of a higher status. Examples of high power distance cultures include India, China, and Japan. Low power distance cultures rely on little to no hierarchy among groups, and therefore do not have a high level of anxiety in communicating with those in higher status groups. Some examples of low power distance cultures include the United States, Canada, Germany, and Australia. Now, when considering organizations, those operating in cultures with high power distance are formal and hierarchical. There's a clear separation between superiors and subordinates. While organizations and cultures with low power distance believe in social equality, so you'll tend to see more relaxed attitudes about titles and status. Now again, the countries I've used to describe the different types here are simply generalizations. By no means do I mean to say that they are exactly as this is and we are starting to see changes in attitudes and how things are seen as a result of globalization and access to other cultures. Well, I find these differences fascinating, but these differences do present some interesting intercultural challenges that communicators experience when interacting with others. We will cover 3. They are anxiety, ethnocentrism, and discrimination. People often become anxious about how they might be perceived when communicating with someone from another culture. The more positive experiences people have with those who are different from them, the more confident they are in their ability to interact with people that are different from them. Ethnocentrism is the belief in the superiority of one's cultural group and the tendency to view another culture through the lens of your own culture. Ethnocentrism is very different from cultural or ethnic pride because it expresses a bias on behalf of your own culture when you treat others as inferior or inconsequential or ignore them altogether. Again, workplaces are increasingly multicultural and businesses are increasingly global. Learning about other cultures is no longer optional. People who are ethnocentric are often trapped by cultural stereotypes. Again, stereotypes are oversimplified images or generalizations of a group. These can be positive or negative, but both have negative repercussions. Discrimination is behavior toward a person or group based only on their membership in a particular group, class, or category. Discrimination happens when those attitudes negatively impact how you behave toward a group, class, or category. Organizations also have their own cultures. Each organization for some subdivision may operate within its own cultural rules as well. While there is universal agreement that organizational culture exists and that it plays a crucial role in shaping behavior in organizations, there's little consensus on what organizational culture actually is, not to mention how it influences behavior and whether it is something that can be changed with a change in leadership. But clues about organizational culture can be derived from the following: how things are done, or what the observable patterns of behavior are. So for example, are the organization's employees rushed to complete tasks? Do they frequently work late? Are they expected to be available at all hours, etc.? How people are incentivized looks at the core of how people are rewarded in the organization. The best predictor of how people behave or what they do is based on what they are incentivized to do. Incentives aren't always monetary. Non-monetary rewards include status, recognition, advancement, etc. The organization's story is not only how an organization describes itself and its history, but also what the values and rituals of the organization are that reinforce the organization's narrative. What is considered right and wrong looks at behavioral norms, or what happens to those who don't stay within the lines. Each organization is shaped by the broader culture of the societies in which it operates. What does the broader culture value? What are its norms, its story? These will shape the organization as well. So how can you learn more about a company's culture? Well, research. When you visit the organization, is it quiet or is it bustling? Are people isolated in offices or do they work in open office spaces? Are people talking to each other in the office? What's the decor like? The environment? Study the physical setting. Read what a company says about itself. What are the running themes? What does their mission statement say? Do they even have a mission statement? And just as important as what is said, to some degree, it's just as important what is not said. So this has to do, to some degree, with the communication practices of the organization. So do people know a lot about the organization, or are they very secretive about their practices in business? So observe these communication practices. You could also interview company people or people who used to work there. But you have to take this information with a grain of salt and also take care to ask questions delicately. Finally, how do people spend their time? Are they expected to work long hours and then socialize with company employees during their off time? Are people expected to volunteer during their off time? Is there an off time? Again, a lot to learn. Well, until next time. Thanks.